Welcome to the Martin Museum of Art. We are a part of the Department of Art and Art History at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. The museum is located inside the Hooper Schaefer Fine Arts Complex.
Hello, I'm Sharon Grip, and I'm here today on behalf of the Martin Museum of Art at Baylor University to visit with artist Rachel Meginnes, whose artwork is currently on display in the gallery at the Martin Museum of Art. Before I introduce Rachel, I would like to give our viewers a little background on her. Rachel is an artist and an educator. She has a bachelor's in art and her MFA in fibers. She has also spent 2 years studying traditional Japanese textile processes in Morioka, Japan, and she co-owned and operated an international rug company based in Sikkim, India, and Seattle, Washington. In 2012, Rachel was awarded a 3-year residency at Penland School of Craft in North Carolina, which put her on a path to making artwork full-time. Her work has been exhibited internationally in Thailand and Hong Kong and can be found in the collections of the United States Art and Embassies Program in Amman, Jordan, the Cameron Art Museum in Wilmington, North Carolina, the University of Arkansas, and Fidelity Bank in Raleigh, North Carolina. As an educator, Rachel has taught all ages from underserved youth in after-school programs to incarcerated men in prison to college-age students and adults in the midst of choosing and changing their careers. Her workshops have been offered at craft schools and colleges across the United States and in Canada. Rachel, we want to thank you for being with us today and giving us an insider's perspective on your art and your process. So my first question is, what made you want to be an artist?
I think, when I think back to that time, it would have been in high school, certainly. I had been invested in music. I actually kind of thought that would be the direction I would go. But there was something about, I think, my teacher at the time and the openness that I was granted. And it was definitely, I had always used my hands as a kid. My mom was a knitter and a sewer and a rug hooker. So I just always kind of used my hands in craft and loved to be surrounded by color, pattern, feel things pretty deeply. I have pretty intense emotions. So art was a place to really kind of put that out in the world in a way that felt really good to me. And I think as I kind of progressed in art, what became really interesting to me and really vital was that art is this place that not only do you find answers, but you're actually asked to come up with the questions. And I really love that freedom to dream and think and question and answer.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a really open space for me.
Yes. Okay. Well, you said that you were, I guess, kind of very tactile with learning to do things like knitting and things like that with your mother. And so is that what kind of led you to textiles?
Yeah, it was actually in high school. And to graduate, we had to find a mentor in our community. It was a really small town in rural Vermont. And so we had to find someone to work with to learn something new. It was totally up to us. And one of my best friends at the time, who knew me really well, said, I think you should learn how to weave. There's just something about it that I think would fit your personality. And she was right. I mean, the minute I touched thread and started working on a loom, there was something about the systems that you need to utilize to warp a loom and weave on there. So there's a structure that you have to kind of be in tune with. And then there's this open canvas, open space for creation. And I'm someone, I think that musical interest kind of comes to light here too, is like, I like a system to work within, but then I want the freedom to take it where I need it to go. Yeah. So
structure and
definitely,
creativity.
yes. And so that hit in high school. And then I pretty much decided after that project that I wanted to continue studying weaving and
Mhm.
found colleges that would support that inquiry. And then, yeah, just continued on from there. Went to Japan to study textiles and then grad school. And yeah, never ends.
So, what is significant about the materials that you use in this particular body of work?
Sure. And this body of work is really a culmination of about 5 years, I guess, working with old quilts. So before that time, I'd been working with commercial cloth or cloth I had woven. And I also, being me, was an avid collector of old textiles. There's something to them that I adore. And so people actually, they noticed my own collection and then would start giving them to me. And it was actually during that 3-year residency that you mentioned, and I was nearing the end, and I was looking at a big studio, and I was looking at these piles of materials and quilts and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm never going to have a studio this large again. Like, I have to go through these, I have to get rid of these. And as I started working with them, I took a quilt out and I thought, well, before I kind of pass this along to someone else, let me just sit with it and think about what I could do. And I started taking the quilt apart and thinking that I would maybe piece it in a different way or kind of change the aesthetic into something I was more drawn to. And that act of taking it apart just became this process of discovery. So, the quilt you see on the outside, that one in particular turned out to have an entire quilt on the inside that no one else could see. And so it was just so intriguing to keep diving deeper to see what was under there. And so all of the work that's in the show at the Martin Museum is made from old quilts in some form or another, either the battings that were on the inside or the outer quilts that, we'd normally see. And what I really love about the quilts is not only kind of what's hidden in the layers that you normally don't see, but it's the past experience or the past of that object embedded in the material. So there are stains, there are holes, there are tears, and there's something to me that's really meaningful about that. I love the way a textile can absorb history and absorb not just history, but care and love, I think, that was used in the creation of the object and then the keeping of that object. Um, yeah, so I don't know, it's something that hits me pretty deep in the heart.
Well, that's interesting. You bring up the usability, or I think about the usability, serviceability, I guess is more the term I'm looking for quilts, in that you found a quilt inside of one. And I can actually remember a great aunt telling me sometimes that they would reuse and put it inside. And as you said, that's exactly what you found. And you really don't know what's going to be hidden there until you do part of your art process, which is to deconstruct. So
Yeah.
interesting. So you said that your materials, that many of them have been given to you. So is that primarily how you go about getting quilts, or how do you get the quilts, the material that you use?
At this point, pretty much all of them that I receive now are given to me. I think in some ways people know, even though I do deconstruct them, which could seem kind of harsh, maybe, or drastic, a lot of people kind of entrust these objects to me, knowing that whatever I do with them will be with intention and care and honoring to the original quilt. So a lot of people who, with their own best intentions have held on to these objects because maybe their aunt made them or their great grandmother. But the truth is they're not being used in the home anymore. And they usually sit in a cupboard or a drawer or even a barn. And they're just left there. And I think over time people start to feel bad
Mhm.
that they're just sitting there not doing anything. And so I've become this repository for 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 really beautiful objects that get to kind of transform into something new. And there are points when I'll go to eBay
Mhm.
and I'll look for quilts, and oftentimes I'm looking for the ones that they call cutter quilts. And what that term means is that they're so worn that, there's a good chance maybe they were stored in a tobacco barn and a mouse got into the box. Or I had one that clearly a dog had like chomped an entire corner off of. So they're so destitute. They're so bad that there's no way these can be used as a quilt anymore. And they're called cutter because people who source them kind of cut out the good parts. So they make stockings or they make pillows. And so I really love those ones that are just totally destroyed, essentially.
Mhm.
I think there's a little bit of leeway there in my mind of kind of like, well, this can't get any worse. So, so like, I'm free to do what I'm free to do.
It can only improve from this point.
Right, right, exactly.
Well, in a way, it's kind of like I know they're inanimate objects, but it's kind of like you're rehoming them, and you're giving them new life and new purpose and in many ways, new meanings, you know?
I
So,
think so. Yeah.
so you said you sat with a quilt, when you were first thinking about using or getting rid of some quilts. You said you sat with it, and so when you look at a quilt, do you get a feeling or do you see something in them that inspires you, or what's kind of your process there? What moves you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a series of feelings. So if I'm sourcing the quilt myself, let's say on eBay, I'm looking for patterns or colors or textures because there are different battings. There are old battings and new battings, and I kind of have a sense now if they'll have holes in them or not. So I'm looking for texture and color and pattern, knowing full well that once I actually start working with the quilt, I might be totally drawn in a different direction. So it is this interesting challenge of I'm drawn to something initially, and then as I start to deconstruct it, it's like because I get to see inside and I get to see the holes, and maybe the colors that are showing on the outside of the quilt on the inside are the original colors, and that difference between the two, the faded and the original, is fascinating to me. Or I remember taking apart one quilt that still had the old newspaper pieces that they had used to cut the piecework. And, so it's like everything becomes a point of inspiration to me, to the point that it can be really overwhelming. And in the way that I'm wanting to honor, I'm not wanting to destroy or ruin this amazing object. And so the pressure can build, the inspiration can build, and I find myself kind of having to step back for a period of time and sit with it and really focus on what ends up being the thing that I will prioritize for that one piece. It is really amazing that each quilt can lead me in a different direction. And that process has become part of the work in and of itself, like that emotional kind of interaction with the quilt, having to make decisions to move forward to make a piece. Like I have no choice. I have to decide at some point. And that I think that process becomes part of what I see in the work. And although I don't know that someone who is looking at the work would necessarily know that I went through that process, I do think that there's a sense of depth or layering or processing in the aesthetics of the work. So it's there. Um,
Well,
yeah, in every way.
I think in many times in many artistic endeavors, there is a process, and a lot of it's an emotional process, and it does take time. And clearly, you spend a lot of time in thinking about it and in what direction would be most meaningful, honoring the quilt and then what it's going to become. For this body of work, what inspired you to focus your art in this particular area? And I say this area because it seems like several of the pieces have kind of a social commentary or realization even.
Yeah, so the work that's in the museum, I would say touches on three different bodies of work
Mhm.
that were started in 2018. So there are two pieces in the show, Reconstruction and Whiteout, which I think would fall into that social commentary. And they were made at a point when I was studying very deeply white supremacy in the United States because I was teaching a class about craft in Southern Appalachia throughout the last century. And so in my research, and I think just in the environment that's surrounding us, we're becoming more and more aware. And I was so deeply immersed in that research alongside this making and this awareness around quilts and their history within the United States. And so there's a bit of a reckoning with my awareness of that history and kind of how to sit with that. Um, and that ended up going into the quilts and into the titles of the quilts, um, almost as a metaphor. And then the second body of work is the bulk of the work in the show. So the piece that's behind you, called History Repeating, and then Telltale, and the more really brightly colored works
Mhm.
were the next series that I did. And I think the best way to describe that work was I was really kind of come out of this period of darkness. I think partly that research and that reckoning with our history's past, also some personal reckoning with like a tendency towards sorrow and mourning, and really this new awakening of I want to create things that bring light and hope. And so I freed myself up in that work to really um, almost act more immediately with things and not overthink them, and really focus on the brightness and the colors that I was originally drawn to in the quilts themselves. And then the final pieces that are closer to where I am right now are the weavings, Meander and Sully, and then a little tiny embroidery called Seed, in which I'm wanting to utilize more of the existing colors of the quilt rather than me kind of removing the pattern and the color and then essentially putting it back into the piece. And so that's done through actually working with almost deconstructing and reconstructing without the use of paint. So the weavings are quilt tops and quilt backs that have been cut in a way that when they're woven, they line up with a compressed, almost abstraction of the original pattern.
Yes.
And there's a lightness and a playfulness to that that I think I'm personally really enjoying. For a long time, my studio practice was not a playful place. It was a very serious, serious place. And I really found that I had to brighten that up a little bit to keep going.
Sure. Well, as in all things in our life, we need balance. And
Yes.
it sounds like you brought a little balance to your studio and your life. The one that is behind me was my favorite piece, and that's why I chose that one. So I guess I wanted a little lightness as well because I very much enjoyed that one. But of course, I think all of them are wonderful and inspiring and very interesting. So talking about kind of the role of artist and what the thoughts they bring to people when they look at pieces. What do you think your role as an artist is in society, or artist in general play in society?
Yeah, I think artists, whether we want to be or not, are often seen as a place to share our whole beings with people. So it's kind of on us to bring our whole selves to the table. And in that, because of that, kind of what I spoke of earlier, of like, not only are we answering a question, we're actually deciding what that question even is. And so in doing that, you're sharing a lot of yourself and a lot of what you think is important. And you're doing it day in and day out. And so I think along with that comes almost what I think of as like being a spotlight on vulnerability. So personal vulnerability, as well as like this model of ingenuity. So during my 3 years at Penland, part of the deal was that I had to have an open studio so people could come in. And so it would be people taking classes, all ages, 18 to 80. You'd have people coming to visit the Blue Ridge Mountains with their whole family, from grandma to the 2-year-old, and they'd come in. And I think what I remember people being most fascinated by was just my my desire and ability to like have trust in what, like, have this vision and then have the trust to bring it into being and then just share it with people. Like, it wasn't even just the making, it was then being able to offer it. And so I think there's something really powerful in that space of kind of putting yourself on a stage in a way to share something meaningful and to not be scared that it's not enough or that it's not worth doing. You know, we live in a society that I think can downplay art.
Mhm.
And but at the same time, I think artists kind of show where life can be and how life can be. And that's really important to me. And that's part of the reason I'm still doing it.
Well, I think, I think it takes a lot of courage, and I hadn't really thought of that until you just said that. But it really, because you're putting your thoughts and your ideas and your interpretation out there for really the world to judge in some ways. But I think more than judgment, I think what happens is a lot of realization, new ideas, new thoughts that you inspire as an artist, in others. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I always, when I think of schools or institutions maybe downplaying the role of art, STEM before it was STEAM, I just kept saying, like, if you're trained in art, like you have the ability to do so much. Like you are useful in any space. Like you have the ability to not only envision what's possible, but to make it happen. Like those are awesome skills to have. Not
absolutely.
to mention like the perseverance to keep going, you know.
Yes, absolutely. So, what artist movements or historical events have any of those things influenced or motivated you?
Absolutely. I think for a really long time, the Bauhaus school in Germany, so kind of World War I to World War II, the school that really upheld more of inequality between the arts. So there was weaving, painting, architecture, kind of all under the same roof. Now, if you look back at that history, you'll find that women were only allowed to be in fibers. They couldn't be, so not everything was great, but in so many ways, I think they paired art, craft, and design in a way that was really meaningful to me as someone who kind of had my hands in all those worlds. And some specific artists that were at that school, because of World War II, being Jewish, they emigrated to the United States, and in doing so became part of the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. And the educational model there has greatly influenced my work as a teacher, as well as kind of my own inquiry as an artist. So this belief that materials can guide you and that you can be in conversation with them versus your materials, you dictate what your materials will do. It's more of a give and take that I really appreciate. And it feels much more holistic to me. And so definitely the artists kind of within those two schools, and most recently, the quilters of Gee's Bend, who are still an active quilting group in Gee's Bend, Alabama. Um, their work kind of took hold in the 60s and then again in the 90s as this group of functional quilters who really, were producing works for their own use because they were relatively poor and needed warm bedding. And, it was very much in service to needs, not in service to making art for the wall. And these quilts were kind of taken out of the context of the home and put on the walls of major museums, and all of a sudden, like, you see an even another power kind of level of power to those objects. And I was really fortunate, and I got to do a short workshop with one of the current Gee's Bend quilters. And I remember her, quilters can kind of be they want everything to line up and they want everything to be perfect, right? And so they go out and they source the perfect fabric, and it's really sweet. But the Gee's Bend quilters kind of take it from a different approach. It's what do we have? Oftentimes using old clothes of loved ones, old material that can no longer be used in that original way, and making the best of that and making something that really brings joy to them. And my favorite part of that workshop was when, she had asked us to bring a bag of fabric, and she told us to, okay, open up your bag and dump it on the floor. And I remember one of the participants saying, okay, well, now, Louisiana, tell us what to do. How do we do it? And she's like, well, pick up a few pieces and make something that makes you happy. And to me, that simplicity is so true. And I think people enter into workshops kind of believing that there's this magical way or this one way to make something happen, and to realize like her path was to follow joy just made my heart sing. And so I think, like the Giesman quilters, self-taught artists of all sorts are a real inspiration to me, because they're coming at it from a real need to make and a real deep personal connection to what that making is. It just feels so authentic to me. That I think when you've gone through school, a little bit of that gets stripped away. You know, it's harder to find that authenticity without overthinking it.
Mhm.
So,
Well, that's a beautiful story, and I think so true about a lot of the things in life, that sometimes when going through the process of learning something, we sometimes maybe lose the joy of it, or we lose the inspiration of it in learning the process of it, if that makes sense at
right.
all.
Totally. Absolutely.
So, well, what's coming up next for you? What are you working
Well,
on now?
so this, I guess, this whole year, time is strange to me, but
For
this
everyone.
summer, yeah, this summer I purchased a digital loom from a former instructor of mine, and it's still currently sitting in pieces, waiting to be put together. But that's really kind of my next big endeavor. Is I'm back at the loom. I hadn't woven in 15 years
Oh, wow.
before this last series of work, so it's a pretty big step to be moving in that direction. But I'm really excited about the potential with this loom. So the beauty of it is that the weaving action is almost as simple as your most basic weave structure on a normal loom, but each thread is individually automated by what you program into the computer. So I can take a digital image and then I can translate that in through a program and get these really complex structures, but with a really simple weaving process, if that makes sense. And so I'm excited to use the reused materials, so the quilts, with this digital process to see kind of to layer it in a different way. So not layering it with paint, but layering it with thread and fabric.
I find that to be such a unique concept, to deconstruct a quilt and yet actually weave it into something new. That's
Yeah.
it's really interesting. Well, of course, we have a lot of students and the art department that will obviously be touring and have toured this exhibit. And so they have a few questions. One of them is, how do you come up with titles? And this was actually from one of the professors in the department. How do you come up with the titles for your pieces? Because one of the things that they said was that their students often struggle with coming up with titles. So, how do you do that?
Yeah, I think, for the last couple of years, the titles come at different points. I try not to force them. So every once in a while, I have the title from the beginning. So Whiteout would be an example of that.
Mhm.
I knew that my process of painting reminded me of this, like our ability to hear something and then almost move past it or forget it. And so I had that one up front. Whereas like reconstruction came over the process of making the piece. Usually I'm I'm titling at the end, and I try to stick to a feeling that I had while making the work. Oftentimes I also like to play with language, and so I might know that the title is alluding to a feeling that I had. Yeah, I'll often play with language so that the title can be read in multiple ways. Yeah, partially because I want people. The titles are important to me.
Mhm.
They can be a kind of a portal into the work, but I don't want them to limit the work as well. And I want people to be able to enter the work and then go where they need to go.
Right. Well, you've already obviously given, I think, students a lot of good ideas to think about, and especially when it comes to their own work. But if you had some advice to give students, or if you were talking to your younger self as an artist. What do you have any advice that you would give yourself or young students?
I do. I'm full of advice. I think through no fault of any institution, but I think that as artists in an educational environment, we're often taught to separate who we are as individuals and people from who we are as artists. And I think that that is a disservice to the depth that our work can go. And I understand it on one level. I think there's a challenge if you're working from a deep point of personal experience or personal need. You can teeter over that line and maybe push people away. You've offered too much information. It's too personal, and people are just like, enough is enough. But I think that if you're working from a place that you have deep experience in, that can be relayed in a universal way that can really actually pull people in. And so I don't know. And I would push that further and just say that I think there are aspects of our personalities as people that are truly who we are. And if we can bring those personality traits into how we work with material or how we think about a piece, then it's just going to be so much deeper of a piece of work. And so I think in order to do that, we have to have the courage to follow what feels right to us. And again, by no fault of academia, I think artists are often asked to know why before they make it. And I would encourage that you make it and then you figure out why. So hopefully I'm not offending any of the instructors.
No, I think that's a perfect way to end the interview. I want to say that we appreciate your time today in visiting with me, and this allows obviously the students and anyone in the community who comes through. And we do have a lot of community visitors here in Waco who come through our Martin Museum of Art, and so this allows them a way to also go online and see what you have to say about your artwork. And like I said, is for students and faculty to also hear from you. We just want to thank you so much for your time and then for your artwork, sharing your artwork with our museum. And we look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
Well, thank you so much. It was a delight to talk with you.
Thank you for visiting the Martin Museum of Art. If it is an option for you, we would love to have you visit us in person and see the art up close. We are open Tuesday to Saturday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and Sunday from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Due to COVID safety procedures, last guests must enter the museum by 4 p.m.